This is a series of conversations on great individuation, the full capacity for human psychological and spiritual development. Murray Stein is a celebrated Jungian psychoanalyst living in Switzerland, and Jim Manganiello is a pioneering depth psychologist and a long-time Dzogchen practitioner living in Boston. In this conversation, they discuss the danger posed to individuation by groups, tribes, nations, institutions, organizations, large and small.
Jim, I'm going to ask you, what is it about organizations that kills the spirit? We can see that in religions and psychology organizations and institutes everywhere. What is it that is so poisonous about organizations?
I think it's a great question. It's a very important question for us. I think the image that comes to mind, we've spoken about how some of the most important experience of the human mind is spiritual revelation, where suddenly in a kind of timeless illumination, one encounters truth at a level that just turns the lights on big time. And one of the problems with organizations is when they get hold of a revelation, they create a box and they try to stuff that revelation in the box. And then they begin to try and protect it and understand it, particularly protect it against people that don't agree with their version of the box, while they're insisting that what they're really protecting is the revelation. And this is, I think, what happened with early Christianity when the organized church began to kill the Gnostics, began to first criticize them for being arrogant and missing the boat because they weren't following the vision that the apostles had the word, and the word was it came down, and the gospels and so on and so forth. In any event, the early Gnostics in Christianity understood Jesus to be saying, follow me. Don't believe in me. Do what I've done. Now, if you say that in the wrong place, you're at risk of being stoned. You were especially that then. So if we take a leap and we talk about Jung, I think Jung's work was about inner life. He was an exception to the rule. He wasn't part of what he was embattled with, I think, with Freud was that, and I think Freud has been terribly misunderstood in many regards, particularly in the context of his difficulties with Jung. But in any case, Freud was dealing with personality, and Jung was talking about the part of the mind that was beyond personality, the part of the mind that was the essential ingredient of inner life. And an awful lot of his work was focused on inner life, cultivating his own inner life. And then at a certain point in time, there was this desire to create an organization around his work. You referenced Joseph Wilmite, who came to Jung and said, we're going to build an institute in your name. Are you pleased to hear that? And my recollection is that he said, quite the contrary, there'd be nothing more difficult for me to be pleased with.
Yes.
And yet we have institutes.
Keep it as disorganized as possible. What Jung liked about the Gnostics was that they were individuals who had an experience. To be a Gnostic, you had to have the experience. And supposedly what we cultivate in analysis, people come into analysis and they have experiences that they tell us about, and in the analysis or in their dreams, in their everyday life. And some of those experiences could lead us into reflection on the spiritual, let's say spirituality. is that picked up by analysts, and what can we do with that when it comes in to our practices? We don't want to just make stamped out cookie cutter Jungians produced
Right.
from the analytic process. We want
Yes.
people who
Yeah.
have had the experience.
That's
How
a key question. Key question. And you raise an important issue, because at a certain point, then the organization begins to, again, if we stay with the image of it, the revelation, if we conceive of, just for the sense of framing it, a lot of Jung's work being considerable revelation, his Gnostic experiences were experience of knowledge, not experience of ideas, but experience of knowledge. So the question becomes, who do the Jungian institutes even recognize that knowledge? Let alone have they figured out a way to transmit that knowledge or to make it accessible to trainees who sit again and again and again reading Jung's collected works. I think I may have mentioned to you, in an act of imagination with Jung, I asked him, what should we do with your collected works? And he said, burn them, at least for 3 years, so that people could fall back on their own direct experience, make use of his leg on the relay race, his invaluable work that he's left behind, so that we could connect the dots for our own leg, so to speak. But I don't think he was particularly excited about being followed.
No, he said explicitly, don't imitate me. Whatever you do, don't imitate me. Imitation is catastrophic for individuation. You aren't becoming yourself, you're becoming somebody else.
Yes.
And that's been the problem in Christianity with imitatio Christi and so on, flagellating oneself, trying to be like Jesus and so forth. And Jungians, like everybody else, are tempted to follow the leader and try to become like the leader, imitate,
Yes.
become a new version of the leader. And this is a tremendous problem. It's exactly contradictory to what individuation is meant to be.
Yes. I think I think that hits an important nail right in the head. That we're purportedly working in the service of individuation, and yet we're violating its basic tenets in our own lives. And I would again say this is egocentrism. This is the dilemma of being embodied in time and not fully understanding your own mind. And before you know it, consolidating an experience of identity that's largely driven by discursive thought. And you begin to become very protective of what your view of reality is. You're protecting your own identity in a way. So the question, I think, for us is, okay, no blame. We don't have to fault anyone necessarily, but the time is arising that we really need to look and see this and come to terms with it. How do we counter this tendency? It's a little bit like a GPS that's giving you wrong directions. At a certain point, you have to figure out how to stop following it. You have to be clear about the territory you want to be in.
Yeah, the GPS that takes you down the wrong trail and then leaves you in the middle of the woods in the dark night. Yeah.
And even to realize that is, I think, the first necessary, essential step in awakening. Where the GPS, the faulty GPS, will tell you if you're trying to go from Boston to San Francisco, it'll tell you in Idaho you've reached your destination. And then if you say, oh, wow, I love California, you're gone. There's got to be some ability to say, this isn't California. You know, I either have to get a new GPS or I have to I at least have to rethink about believing this one. Not easy territory.
So what is California? Um, um, without painting a detailed picture of the goal of the process, let's say the arrival at the big S self, can we give some clues as to how we know if we have arrived at the big S self or we're stuck in Idaho thinking we maybe are, but we don't know for sure? How do we know?
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer in an absolute way with one or two photographs. I mean, you have to become a student of your own process. So that, for example, we can, you know, you and I have been talking and we're working on this issue of what's the connection between individuation in time and individuation beyond time. So it's not a question that can be fully answered in time until you have some experience of timelessness, what we could call the core, the ultimate experience of individuation. That is, who are we really? It's very difficult to answer that question without just chasing your tail around a tree.
Exactly, yeah.
So that if I've had a glimpse, you know, I think one of the mistakes we all tend to make is that we come to a profound intellectual understanding of what Jung was talking about with respect to individuation. We followed that up with a careful and also very close understanding of what Murray Stein was talking about, individuation. And, you know, this begins to glow in the dark. It's very important and very important material, but we mistake it for California. We mistake it for that we've arrived in some way, that we understand this. We've done a little of the work on ourselves. We, you know, in our own analysis, we've encountered these things. But it's like Gerhard Dorn having to tell the truth in his final stage of individuation intellectually, that he still hasn't arrived.
Yeah.
You can't arrive in time, so to speak. You just can't. So, and that raises the whole thing of, okay, a psychology has to be deeply interested in resting on foundational truth rather than getting lost in the organization. I mean, if you look at the war, the conflict between Jung and Freud and between the two organizations, Jungian and Freudian, it becomes very noisy in the same way that conflict between two organized groups have in any arena.
Yeah.
So your question, I think, is how do we get to experience how do we get to experience the core of individuation on a timeless level, which would then shed light and contribute to our ability to individuate authentically in time? I think it's a direct experience of knowledge. It's knowledge. It's not intellectual understanding. Matter of fact, intellectual understanding very often interferes with the kind of understanding we're talking about, the experiential knowledge of who I am beyond time, which we're referring to as the capital S self. Understanding the word self has been, you know, you get to the point where you can find it in a cereal box. We're trying not to confuse it with this or that definition, but just say ultimate reality beyond time. Could call it the unus mundus, we could call it God. But there's got to be some direct experience of that. Now, we've talked about the contemplative sciences.
Okay, yeah, let's tackle that topic. What is that? What I know about contemplation You know, there are the contemplative orders in the
Yeah.
Catholic Church. There are 5 or 6 of them. We know about, you know, the desert fathers who were contemplative, sitting in their little huts out in the wilderness, meditating. But in those traditions, they didn't talk about science. There's contemplation, the contemplative life. Now the word science has appeared, contemplative
Yeah.
science. And I'm curious about that. Where did that come from, and what does it add to what we have known about the contemplative practices?
Yeah, I think that's a critically important question. Has implications for what we're talking about, the interdependence between self and self, small s, capital S, has implications for the interdependence between psychology and spirituality, which really needs to be addressed because they're not separate. But, you know, when you mention contemplation in the Christian traditions or in the traditions of the book, we could say, they're certainly related to what we're talking about, contemplative science, but it would be like mistaking Jung's son for Jung. They're related, but they're not the same. They're distinctly different. So, you know, it's important that we understand contemplation in the non-dual tradition is very, very precise. It's being in the so-called natural state. It's being in the direct experience of the self, capital S, not as a subject viewing an object or becoming aware of an object, but as the experience itself, the defining experience itself. Only that is referenced as contemplation. Particularly in Dzogchen mind science or Dzogchen psychology, which is the contemplative tradition that has come forth from the Tibetan Bön Buddhist traditions. Just a note, in the West, it's transitioning now, trying to, I think, become free and unencumbered from any cultural tradition, be it Tibet, be it Indian, be it Eastern, whatever. So
Well,
the question is,
that's significant because science is not tied to culture. Science is
right,
freed from culture, right? A laboratory in India, a laboratory in America, you do the same experiments, you get the same results. So it's not bound to
yes,
cultural uh, practices or habits or traditions. It's freed from that. So contemplative science has freed itself from particular researchers or traditions, and it says it applies universally, cross-culturally. Is that right?
uh, uh, absolutely, critically important issue. Now, especially in the sense that if we say that contemplation, if we begin to operationally define it as being in the experience of direct knowledge, then that would universally apply no matter where you were. It's absolutely separated from any particular tradition.
Mhm.
Contemplative science methods, however, they're broad, they can be applicable to any culture. You and I can use it. Somebody in Europe, Asia could use it, and we get the same results. What
Yeah.
we're talking about, the difference is it's the first person systematic exploration of mind. There have been particular biases particularly with Western science, that if you're involved in introspection, it's very unreliable and it falls short of the standards that we need to accept for something being valid.
Right.
And that's taken a life of its own. I mean, it's almost become, it's an important part of the science church. You know, that if you're not using those, well, in actual fact, if you look at it carefully, it's limited. First of all, it's temporal. It's also limited to material reality. This third person observation is like, I can study your mind by virtue of these indirect methods. I can gather data, and then I can run some statistical tests on them and determine whether the hypothesis I've created about your mind is valid or not. And if it is valid, then I feel like I've discovered a fact. Well, I have, but it's not a truth. So what the contemplative science has done is given us the methods to use in order to experience the capital S self.
And the laboratory is the individual mind.
Individual mind. Now, what I would love to say, if we could create a revolution, or if we could say maybe everybody took a week of psychedelic or something, that we could get together and we could ask people, now, before you object to this, hear it very clearly. What we're going to do is we're going to use these methods collaboratively and do our very best to be open in our communication with each other and to fend off, to ward off the premature intrusions in our own mind that I already know this.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I having to do this? Or Schopenhauer said in 1973 that if you take too many lefts, you'll never get to where you go. And before you know it, we wind up in an intellectual conversation that appears to be very erudite and well considered, but it's just idiocy.
Mm-hmm.
And we're far removed from the direct experience. How can we train as psychologists to explore the methods of contemplative science to see if we can validate them or not in collaborative context where we can communicate with each other? No need to figure out how to publish things right away. I mean, of course, we're not ruling out anything. We're not. But if you take a look at science, what has at one point had a wonderful opportunity to make significant contributions to humanity, its darkness is beyond comprehension today.
Mm-hmm.
It has basically become a thug for commerce. No matter what direction we look at, it has not contributed to feeding starving children. It has not contributed to stopping wars. It has not contributed significantly to stopping climate change. Yes, it's understood it from a distance, but even scientists don't want to hear it. They want to advance their careers. So, and you look at some of the data, the combination of science and religion, you know, if you take even very religious people, they buy into the materialistic vision of life. They don't subscribe to it. They say they believe in God. They say they believe in whoever the figures are in their religion. But at the end of the day, they believe in materiality, that the world is essentially material.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, you know, science is responsible for that, as is the church, which is that the church imagines that, well, the sacred dimension of life is to be found later. We're just here to eat and screw around with each other. You know, I don't know if you're aware of this, but so if you take a look at what science and commerce have done, the drug industry now has peer-reviewed science journals filled with articles that they've ghosted.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at things like the statin drugs, or it wasn't that long ago that physicians felt that all women should be on Premarin
Mm-hmm.
in order to avoid heart disease and cancer. in order to avoid the troubles of menopause. And then the significant studies that were done by women, mostly women, demonstrated that quite the contrary. They were causing cancer and heart disease.
Hmm.
You know, we could go on endlessly with this, but I think that we need to ask ourselves, what are the best next steps for us to take in order to perhaps create a psychology that actually can address the problems that we're facing that are leaving our species flirting with destruction?
Mm-hmm. Well, we know in a sense the answer, but the question is how to get to the solution. Um, if you say the problem is the ego, okay, we could say it's self-interest. It's a very narrow sense of self-interest, not the interest of the whole, but the interest of my group or myself, and excludes the other um, based on greed and you know, short-sightedness and so on. If that's the problem, uh, and the answer is to offset egotism, which has a place. One has to protect oneself and one's property and so on. So to a point, it's useful. But how to get to a stage of consciousness that we could say is wrapped up in the unus mundus awareness.
Right.
If you have unus mundus, you realize that you're one with all. With all the others, there are no distinctions, important distinctions, or at least the distinctions that you can see are superseded by other factors of oneness. Um, One can get a glimpse of that occasionally. How to live that. You have methods, Jim. How do you do it? What do you advise by way of getting there and in a strong enough sense to offset
Yeah.
the
Yes.
egotism that is so inherent in our
I think that's a
human being?
key question. I think it's a key question. And we're really asking, what does psychology need to do in order to achieve that end? I think we can take a look at the contemplative science methods. But before we, we try and just fill the hat with this method and that method and this method, we've got to make sense of what is the canvas upon which this painting occurs.
Okay.
So we have to put some wash in the canvas. And to do that, I think we have to talk about what is the view that has arisen from the results of the kinds of practices that are associated with contemplative science.
Yes. Okay. Good.
And one of the most critical, most important views is that anything that's going on ever that is not now in the ordinary temporal sense of past, present, now, future, but now in the timeless sense is not real. Now that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
No, nobody wants to buy into that easily. Many people want to jump on it because it makes them feel, now I understand something profound and everybody else is an idiot. Other people feel like that's nonsense. What are you talking about? This past, this way. But if you look at it carefully, whenever the past comes to mind, it's now. whenever we get to that future point in time, it's now. And in actual fact, what is associated with not being present now is thinking.
Okay.
It's thinking that sweeps us up into either the past or the future or some distraction that leaves us not being now. So we're talking about the ultimate method is being present now. So let's imagine we're at some Jungian institute and we're trying to get people interested in these methods, and we're giving them the opportunity to experience this directly. We would ask them to just observe their minds. This is one, again, a contemplative science, a piece of it, a method, part of the method, where you're just watching your mind. And at a certain point, you'll have to return with the discovery that I'm always thinking. And you know what? I've always just assumed that was reality. What's wrong with that? Well, there are many consequences to always thinking. The first and most important is that if we observe carefully enough, we're always following what we're thinking. We don't experience thought as energy, independent of it. We experience it. So if you were to ask if we could kind of get an electron microscope and really hone in now. So what is the dilemma? What is the seed of egocentrism? It's the tendency to impute solid identity to ourselves based on our discursive thought flow. And again, you have to have some really high quality binoculars, at least, to be able to pick up on this and to pick up on its consequences. You may recall there used to be a theory of why things burnt, and it was the idea that phlogiston was in things, and that's why it burned. And that was considered to be truth and knowledge for quite some time, until all of a sudden that was demonstrated to be false to fact, because what in actual fact was true was oxygen. Oxygen was at play. Well, now we're flirting with that level of discovery, at least. Once we begin to see, I continue to follow my thinking. And one thought leads to another thought, leads to a storyline, leads to a narrative. I am the protagonist in that narrative, either in past time or in future time. Or I'm thinking about something where I'm either great or I'm good or everything's fine or I should have done that, I shouldn't have done that. All of this is just like a dream.
And it all circles around the I in the thoughts.
Yes, 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 yes. So and you said a mouthful, because if that is the case, then we're confronted with an alarming, exciting, but also a little bit alarming experience, which is that this I doesn't really exist as I think it exists. It appears, but it's tricky. The sun appears to rise in the morning, and it doesn't.
Yeah.
So this is an appearance that I need to think carefully about. And I begin to see, yeah, I did it again. Yeah, I did it again. I'm following thought. And at a certain point, you begin to cultivate the method. We could call it what you and I have referenced before as non-meditation. I'm almost hesitant to use the word because I think if we could get rid of the word meditation, we'd be much better off in the task of creating a psychology that. So non-meditation means you don't do anything. There's no effort. You're not trying to develop concentration. You're not trying to look at the candle. You're not trying to think, you're not trying to do anything. You're not sitting cross-legged necessarily, but you're just doing nothing. At a certain point, by doing nothing, the mind begins to settle down. In the same way that if we had a glass of water and we put some granular material in and stirred it up, we wouldn't be able to see the water. But at a certain point, the mind begins to settle down. So as like the glass of particles settles down, all of a sudden you can see the water. As the mind begins to settle down, you begin to encounter deeper levels of awareness, which is mind's true nature. Deeper levels of awareness that are not focused on I or me. In other words, I experience that awareness not as Jim. I experience that awareness as who I am. I don't decide to experience it as who I am. The understanding arises in the direct experience of that.
Awareness.
Yes. It's timeless. It's primordial, meaning it didn't have a beginning. It doesn't have an end. That there's a part of who and what I am that is pure being, and pure being as in timeless awareness. Now, these are just words, so that if you're telling people this, you've got to deal with it. You need an umbrella for all the, I know that already. All right. I started with this, or I started with, and we're talking about its direct experience. So you cultivate that experience, and at a certain point, you notice in the day that you're realizing that you're following your thinking. In other words, you've got some degrees of freedom from releasing from it. And you may recall one of the names of a particular contemplative science is self-liberation.
Yes.
Meaning that when the thoughts hit, you don't become identified with them, you don't become attached to them, you just allow them to release, so that you're once again, you're staying put in that awareness, or at least its proximity. I've referred to that as the free position.
Okay.
Separate from any kind of tribal language, from a religious tradition. It's just the free position. So that when I begin to become entangled and excessively preoccupied with thinking, past, troubled, present, too much agenda, future, I can just pull the plug on that and come back into myself. So at a certain point, go ahead.
Yeah, we've made I think we've dipped our foot in the water, and we need to continue this conversation. The image that comes to me is sitting on the banks of the stream of consciousness that William James talked about, and observing our thoughts flowing on the stream, but sitting quietly and observing. We eventually will arrive at something even beyond that, which we need to reserve for another conversation.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way to end. I think William James and Jung they're probably hanging out together. I think Jung was very enamored of his work, and appropriately so. And William James, in the vein that you referenced, was deeply immersed in the varieties of religious experience and understanding them. And I think that's
so that's the kind of psychology we want to deepen and continue exploring and developing.
Yes, well said, Marie.
Okay, Jim, I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.